Chapter 32. Inside felt like the outside. Passing from the Davos gloom into the vast arena of the Congress Center was like walking from a darkened theater into blazing day. Every corner was brightly lit, the walls and floors all warm, glowing shades of cream, tan, ochre. Stenciled on the wall to the left of the first big atrium were various panels of the globe, continents or parts of continents and shades of brown, crisscrossed with curved lines of latitude and longitude, as if projected from a globe. Ambler strolled further into the buzzing space, almost preternaturally alert to his surroundings. The ceiling, 20 feet above, was a curving expanse of narrow wooden planks, giving the sense that one was inside an enormous ark. He paused at a seating area where coffee was served on small, round, glass-topped tables. Banks of orchids and heavy brown planters were interspersed among them. Raised lettering on an umber wall declared the area to be a World Cafe. The World Cafe. The wall was decorated with the horizontal names of countries, intersected by vertically arrayed capitals like some sort of acrostic. The capitals were in white, the country names in dark brown, except for the overlapping letter. The A in Poland provided the A in Warsaw. The O in Mozambique was the O in Maputo. The I in India held up the stacked letters of New Delhi. Ambler wondered about complaints from countries like Peru and Italy. Still, he could not help but be impressed with the amount of sheer attention that had gone into every incidental detail. The forum's annual meeting took place during 6 days in January, and then all the walls would be repainted, all the sculptures and decorative elements would be warehoused, and yet the decor displayed a level of care and attention that even permanent structures rarely received. Maybe 20 people were at the World Cafe, mainly seated in clear plexiglass chairs. There was the handsome, if slightly mannish woman with the navy skirt suit, a heavy ring on one finger, and what looked at first like a scarf around her neck. As he approached, he saw that her name card was not white like the others, but blue, and that the scarf was in fact a trimline headset in repose. Farther away, he saw a man with a friendly, square, soon-to-be jowly face, heavy frame glasses with amber-tinted lenses, a button jacket strained by the convexity of his belly, a German or Austrian Ambler guest, speaking with the man whose back was to Ambler, a man with fluffy white hair and a dark blue suit. Investment bankers, a bit too pleased to be here, guests rather than participants in the ironclad hierarchy of the conference. At another table, a prosperous-looking man with spare, tidily combed salt and pepper hair was shuffling papers. His eyes were impassive behind his steel-rimmed glasses. He had the air of someone who knew the rules of the road and never broke them. A man with a lighter suit and graying brown hair was speaking to him with greater animation than was returned, obviously, the conversational suitor. A third man with a spread collar and a pink-blue patterned shirt, a polka-dotted tie, a Brit by nationality or aspiration, was leaning toward the other two, openly listening and reserving the right to contribute. There was unease beneath his beaming bonhomie, that of someone who was neither definitely a part of a conversation nor yet definitely excluded from it. Nobody here was his man. At the end of a long corridor on the lower level of the Congress Center, Caston pressed his cell phone to his ear, straining to hear Adrian's instructions. From time to time, the auditor glumly broke in with questions of his own. It wasn't what Adrian had signed up for when he joined the Office of Internal Review, but somehow his dewy assistant did not seem to mind. Indeed, if Caston was not very much mistaken, Adrian seemed to be enjoying his turn as Shifu. Shifu. Ambler walked down a broad, red granite stairway to a sort of mezzanine, like the dress circle of an opera house. Along a corridor snaking off behind the stairs was a blue sign that read TV Studio. Evidently, it was reserved for broadcast journalists to conduct interviews with some of the luminaries in attendance. A sign at another alcove advertised bilateral rooms, presumably reserved for small private discussions. The main flow of traffic on the mezzanine was to the left, toward another gathering spot, an area with wicker chairs and a bar in which were arrayed various small bottles and cans, mainly sodas and fruit juices, and beverages that were in between. A couple of high-mounted television monitors displayed scheduling updates and what looked to be video excerpts from some of the high-profile briefings. As he got closer, he saw that the beverages came from around the world. Frucht soda, a lemon-lime drink from Sweden. Apple Ticer, a fizzy apple juice from South Africa. Maaza, a mango-flavored beverage from India. Even Tutan, a gooseberry-flavored soda from Mexico. It was a Model UN of soft drinks, Ambler thought mordantly. Even more popular was the adjoining computer bay. Radio clusters of chairs and intranet-linked computers, decoratively partitioned by thin rectangular tanks of clear liquid through which a slow and steady stream of bubbles rose. Dozens of fingers clicking at dozens of keyboards. Visages of boredom, satisfaction, uncertainty, aggression, but nothing to detain him. He peered down from the balcony and saw the much larger space below, a terrarium of power. On a vast brick wall opposite him were enormous African and Polynesian sculptures, which consorted oddly with the array of World Economic Forum flags along the balcony's 5-foot inside rim. Ambler descended the flight of stairs to the babbling crowd beneath him, checked his watch, and pushed through the throngs. A mid-afternoon crowd of people between sessions, grabbing canapes that were whisked through on silver trays, or crystal glasses of conference-approved beverages. The air was fragrant with expensive colognes, aftershave, and hair pomades, not to mention the trays of Bündner Fleisch on pumpernickel triangles, a regional specialty. Ambler slowed and began to take in his human surroundings. A youngish, thick-set man in an unfashionable but well-tailored suit, its quality evidenced by the fact that his avoirdupois was well concealed at first glance, was surrounded by members of a slightly frumpy entourage. The man's gaze swiveled around him, taking in everyone but those closest to him. Occasionally he murmured something Slavic-sounding to a waistless, black-haired woman nearby. He was probably a new head of state from one of the Baltic republics, on the lookout for foreign investment. The man's gaze paused at one point, and Ambler followed the sightline. A young, curvy blonde across the room, clearly the trophy wife of the small, withered plutocrat beside her. Ambler nodded at the Slav, and the man nodded back, half formally, half warily. It was a look that said, "Are you somebody?" Look of someone who did not trust himself to know. Ambler sensed, too, that the man's entourage was simultaneously a source of comfort and humiliation to him. He was used to being the most important man in the room. Here at Davos, he was strictly minor league, and there was some discomfiture to have his entourage witness the evident fact. A couple of yards away from him, an older, rangy American billionaire, someone whose enterprise software was an industry standard across the globe, was surrounded by people seeking a word with him, attempting like whistling, chirping modems to establish a connection. He was like a massive planet drawing in satellites. By contrast, few seemed interested in catching the Baltic politician's eye. At Davos, the heads of small states were further down the pecking order than the heads of large multinationals. Globalization, like business process reengineering, did not, quote-unquote, flatten hierarchies, as its boosters proclaimed. It merely established new ones. As Ambler continued his way, he noticed the pattern continuing. Some figures swelled, inflated by the attention they gathered. Some shrank, deflated by the scarcity of it. Yet others seemed jubilant merely to breathe the same air as the giants among them. Tray after tray of canapes disappeared into yearning gullets, though Ambler doubted whether anyone really tasted them. Attention was elsewhere. The social entrepreneurs, quote-unquote, as the savvier heads of charities and NGOs now styled themselves, effectively conceding that only the vocabulary of business had any traction in the new era, chatted energetically with one another, and even more energetically with bona fide entrepreneurs, the sort whose checkbooks could underwrite their programs. A handsome young Indian man was speaking animatedly to a Western businessman with thatchy shelf-like white eyebrows and whiskered ears. "We're all about figuring out what's not working and then fixing it," the young man was saying. "Find out what's stuck and get it unstuck. You must do a lot of that at Royal Goldfields." "In a sense," the old man allowed in a rumble. "You know the saying, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish and he'll just go into competition with you," the old man, the head of some mining consortium, obviously, drawled in a voice buzzy with phlegm. A brief flash of teeth, white against the Indian's dark brown skin. Ambler doubted whether the man's interlocutor saw the annoyance that was so obvious to him. But the real challenge is to transform the whole fishing industry, put it on a rational footing, make sure it pays for itself. Speaking metaphorically, of course, we're all about sustainable solutions, not the quick fix. As Ambler zigzagged through the crowd, he picked up snatches of conversation. "Were you at the Attorney General's breakfast thing?" "You could call us a mezzanine fund for sure, but we'll go in earlier if we're really confident about the risk metrics." I figured out why it's always easier to understand the Francophone African ministers than their French counterparts. They always speak slowly and clearly, just the way they're instructed to in grade school. Anne glanced at dozens of faces, many glimpsed partially, crescents glinting through occluding bodies. From a cluster near the bar, he saw a pair of eyes radiating malevolence and decided to move in for a closer look. As he got there, he saw that the man was being badgered by another, someone in an off-the-rack worsted and a poorly knotted tie, an academic no doubt, though probably one at a high-powered institution and with a high-powered reputation of his own. "With respect, I don't think you really grasp what's happening here," the academic was saying. With respect was one of those phrases that signified the opposite of their literal meaning, rather like perfectly good, as when used of milk that had passed its expiration date. I mean, with respect, maybe there's a reason you haven't been in government since the Carter administration, Stu. The other man's eyes narrowed. He smiled to suggest amusement and disguise his profound annoyance. Nobody's disputing that China's growth rate has been impressive, but the question is whether that's sustainable and what the global consequences are, and whether we're not seeing the beginnings of a bubble as far as foreign investment goes. "Wake up and smell the jasmine," the academic retorted. "It's not a bubble. It's a big tidal wave, and sooner than you think, it's gonna wash away your little sandcastles." The nasal, hectoring tone was his default way of speaking, Ambler suspected. He probably prided himself on his candor and, cushioned by tenure, had little idea how grating others could find him. Ambler turned around and moved toward an arbitrary point in the crowd with a spurious but attention-deflecting air of purpose. Suddenly, a man stepped in front of his path and looked at him with an expression of bewilderment. He spoke to him rapidly in a language Ambler did not understand. Something Slavic again, but different from the language muttered by the politician. I'm sorry, Ambler placed a finger on his ear, miming incomprehension. The man, red-faced, burly, and nearly bald, now spoke in laborious English. I said, I don't know who you are, but you are not who your badge says. He pointed to it. I know, Joseph Rabel, you're not him. At the other end of the hall, Clayton Caston was quailing beneath his icy smile. Under-Secretary Whitfield, he asked. Under-Secretary, Ellen Whitfield turned to him. I'm sorry. She adjusted her gaze downward in more ways than one as she took in the diminutive auditor. My name is Clayton Caston. I'm with the CIA, Office of Internal Review. Whitfield seemed distinctly unimpressed. I'm really here with an urgent message from the DCI. Whitfield turned to the African dignitary with whom she'd been speaking. Will you excuse me? She said apologetically. To Caston, she said, how's Owen doing? I think we've all been better, Caston replied tightly. Would you come with me? It's very important. She tilted her head certainly. The auditor took her swiftly down a rear hallway to a room by a sign that read, Bilateral Room 2. When Whitfield entered and saw that Ashton Palmer was already seated in one of the room's white leather chairs, she turned to Caston. What's this about? She asked evenly. Caston closed the door and gestured for her to have a seat. I'll explain. He took a deep breath before joining them. Under-Secretary Whitfield, Professor Palmer. Let me make a long story short. Well, not so long and not so much of a story. From time to time, a specialist in forensic and investigative auditing turns up things he wished he hadn't. I'm sorry, did I take an unwarranted Home Office deduction? Said the silver-haired scholar with the high distinguished forehead. Caston colored slightly. The intelligence communities in the United States are, as you know, something of a patchwork quilt. One division may be utterly oblivious of an operation authorized by another. So long as legitimate procedures have been followed, the nature of these operations is not my concern. The point about the clandestine services is that their work is clandestine, Whitfield nodded primly. Exactly, including often 2 other clandestine services. But imagine that an analysis of open source data points leads you to uncover an operation that is potentially explosive in its consequences, especially if the operation should come to be exposed. He paused briefly. Then I'd think the person who exposed that operation should consider himself to be responsible for those explosive consequences, Whitfield replied smoothly. Her lips were pressed tightly together. That's logical, isn't it? She was an elegant woman, but there was something deathly about her, too, Caston thought. Her chestnut hair softened her strong features. Her dark blue eyes looked like pools of infinite depths. Is this something you've discussed with the DCI? Asked Palmer. I wanted to talk to you first, the auditor said. That's wise, said Palmer. His eyes were watchful but unintimidated. That's very wise. But you're not getting me, Caston went on. My point is that if I have been able to connect the dots, align the data points, then so will others. Data points? Palmer blinked. They run the gamut from, I'm speaking hypothetically here, you understand? Airplane tickets purchased and trips made to payments routed to foreign officials. They include accounting irregularities to do with the use of PSU resources and many, many other items which I'd prefer not to get into. Palmer and Whitfield looked at each other. Mr. Caston, the professor began, we both appreciate your concern and your caution, but I fear you've become involved in matters that are rather above your head. Top-level command tier decisions, Whitfield put in. You continued to miss my concern. Your concern? Whitfield's gaze was level, her smile disdainful. Which will be shared by the DCI, I have no doubt. Her smile faded. Quite simply, you've been sloppy. You've left a trail of digital spore. What I have been able to find out, others will be able to find out, such as any investigating domestic or international commission, and I wonder whether you factored that into your equations when you devised this harebrained operation in the first place. Whitfield bristled. I don't know what you're talking about, and I very much doubt you do either. All this indirection is getting tiresome. I'm talking about the termination of President Liu Eng. Is that direct enough for you? Palmer blanched. You're not making any sense. Come off it. What I found out is what any competent investigation is going to uncover. You complete the operation and our government is going to get blamed. Sure as shooting. Quintilian, the Roman rhetorician, tells us that the unintended pun is a solecism, Palmer said with a hint of a smirk. God damn it, Caston snapped. You rogue warriors are all the same. You never think ahead. You're so caught up in your scams and gambits and subterfuges that the blowback always takes you by surprise. I have respected the interorganizational partitions, kept quiet to give you the benefit of the doubt. Now I see I was mistaken. I'm going to file my report with the DCI immediately. Mr. Caston, I'm impressed by the seriousness with which you take your work, Whitfield said, suddenly cordial. Let me apologize if I've offended you. The operation you're discussing is an Omega-level special access program. Of course, we trust your discretion and your judgment. Your reputation quite precedes you, but we need you to trust ours as well. You're not helping me to. You talk as if you've been caught smoking in a no-smoking area. Fact is, your special access program is about as private as a Liz Taylor wedding. And my question to you is, what the hell are you going to do about it? Because I can't help you unless you help me. Help me make sense of this goddamn ball of wax. Please don't underestimate the level of calculation and planning that has gone into this, the Undersecretary said. And please don't underestimate the benefits to be secured by it, which are... She turned to the man seated beside her. We're talking about history, Mr. Caston, said the silver-haired scholar. We're talking about history and the making of it. You're a historian, Caston growled. That's the study of the past. What do you know about the future? That's a very good question, Palmer said with a genial, if fast-fading grin. But my studies do tell me this much. The only thing more hazardous than trying to change the course of history is not doing so. That doesn't add up. History, especially these days, is like a race car, dangerous to drive, I'll say. Palmer smiled again. But even more dangerous if you don't. We simply choose not to be a passenger in a driverless vehicle. Enough with the abstractions. We're talking about a head of state, one revered the world over. Men must be judged by their consequences, not their intentions, Palmer said. And consequences must be assessed by the techniques of historical analysis and projection. You're saying you prefer a Chinese despot to a Chinese Democrat? Caston asked, swallowing hard. From the viewpoint of the world, there's hardly any question about it. Despotism, the traditions of autocracy, whether monarchical or totalitarian in form, has kept the lid on Pandora's box. Weren't you ever told as a child that if everyone in China jumped at the same time, the world would be shaken from its axis? Despotism, as you term it, is what has kept the Chinese nation from jumping. Despotism is what has kept the Chinese foot bound. Caston's heart was racing. What you two are doing... Please note, Whitfield said brightly, we're not doing anything. Oh no. Do you see us in that hall? We're not even present at the scene of the prospective incident. We're here, as plenty of people can vouch for. We're here with you, Mr. Caston. huddled in conference. Palmer picked up, a small steely smile playing on his lips, with a senior officer of the CIA. Again, that's something plenty of people can vouch for. The undersecretary flashed a brief, perfect smile. So if we were up to something, the natural inference would be that you were up to the same thing. Not that we expect anyone to be making such inferences at all, Palmer said. They'll be making other inferences. That's what I'm trying to tell you, Keston started. The U.S. government is going to be suspected immediately. Exactly. We're counting on it, Whitfield said. I'm sorry, these geopolitical calculations aren't the usual province of an auditor. All we require is your discretion. You're not paid to have opinions about events of this complexity, but all the eventualities have been explored by our finest minds, or perhaps I should say our finest mind. She gave Palmer an admiring glance. Wait a minute, if the U.S. is suspected. Suspected, yes, but only suspected, Palmer explained to the auditor. The State Department used to call its two-China policy one of constructive ambiguity. Well, constructive ambiguity is exactly what we're aiming for here. Blame, but not absolute knowledge, suspicion without hard evidence, guesses piled upon guesses, but mortared by suspicion into a very strong wall, like the Great Wall of China. Palmer and Whitfield exchanged glances again. Nicely put, Mr. Keston, said the silver-haired scholar with the high, distinguished forehead. Another Great Wall of China, yes, that's what we're talking about. It's the best way to confine a tiger, and as history shows, there's just one way to wall China in. Get the Chinese to build the wall themselves, Keston said slowly. Why, Mr. Keston, the scholar said, it seems you're of our party without knowing it. We both understand the ascendancy of logic, don't we? We both appreciate that ordinary intuitions, including moral intuitions, must capitulate before the clean force of reason. Not a bad place to start, I'd say. You still don't convince me, the auditor said. Maybe the world is messier and less controllable than you know. You think you're the masters of history. From where I sit, you're a couple of kids playing with matches. It's a goddamn flammable world out there. Trust me, Ashton and I have done a very thorough risk assessment of the whole situation. This isn't about risk, Keston said levelly. That's what people like you never understand. It's about uncertainty. You think you can assign a probability metric to future events like this. For technical reasons, we do that all the time, but it's bullshit. Nothing more than a convention and accounting conceit. Risk suggests measurable probability. Uncertainty is when likelihood of future events is simply incalculable. Uncertainty is when you don't even know what you don't know. Uncertainty is humility in the presence of ignorance. You want to talk about reason? Start with this. You made a basic conceptual error. You've confused theory and reality, the model with the thing you're modeling. Your theory has never left space for the most basic and elemental factors in the course of human events, uncertainty. That's what's going to come back and bite the whole goddamn world in the ass. And you state that as a certainty? Palmer retorted. For the first time, his air of equipoise slipped, but he swiftly regained it. Or just a risk? Perhaps you forget the Heraclitus principle. The only thing constant is change. To do nothing is to do something too. You speak of the dangers of acting as if there were some null-set alternative, but there is none. What if we were to decide to let Luang live? Because you see, that's an action as well. What would our responsibilities be then? Have you performed the risk assessment of that situation? We have. You can't step into the same river twice. Nothing ever stays the same. Heraclitus understood that 500 years before the Common Era, and it remains true in a civilizational order he couldn't have begun to conceive. In the event, I trust our logic is clear enough by now. Caston snorted. Your logic has more holes than a shower head. The simple truth is you're putting the nations on course for open warfare. The United States has always performed best when it was on a wartime footing, Palmer said, the voice of disinterested scholarship. Panics and depressions, these things always happened in times of peace. And the Cold War, in fact, a period of endless small-scale skirmishes, was what secured our global preeminence. Americans do dislike the notion of dominating the globe, Undersecretary Whitfield said. In fact, there's only one thing they like less, and that's the prospect of someone else doing it. The auditor took a shaky breath. But the prospect of global war. You act as if any possibility of conflict is to be shunned, and yet as a historian I must report a paradox you seem blind to, Palmer cut in. A nation with the habit of shunning war actually encourages war, encourages acts of belligerence that lead to its own defeat. Heraclitus saw that too. He said, war is the father of all, king of all. Some it makes gods, some it makes men, some it makes slaves, some free. Are you hoping to be made a god, Professor Palmer? Casson asked witheringly. Not at all, but as an American I don't want to be made a slave. And slavery in the 21st century is something imposed not by manacles of steel, but by economic and political disadvantages that no lock can ever open. The 20th century was a time of American freedom. Through inaction, you would seem to prefer a new century of American servitude. You can sermonize about the unknowns. I'll grant the unknowns. But that doesn't justify passivity in the face of aggression. Why be overtaken by events when you could help shape those events? Palmer's voice was a soothing professional baritone. You see, Mr. Caston, the course of history is too important a thing ever to be left to chance. Ambler studied the Slovak's face. Confusion was steadily, irreversibly hardening into suspicion, like epoxy exposed to the air. He glanced at his badge. Jan Skodova. Who was he? A government official? A business colleague or a rival? Now Ambler smiled broadly. You're right about that. We were on a panel together, switched badges as a joke. A beat. Guess you had to be there. He thrust a hand out. Bill Becker from EDS in Texas. Now, how do you know my new friend Joe? I am also a businessman from Slovakia Utilities. Where is Joseph, then? His eyes gleamed like anthracite. God damn it, there was no time. Hey, you got a card? Ambler asked, and pretended to fumble for one of his own. Warily, the Eastern European withdrew a card from inside the breast pocket of his suit jacket. Ambler glanced at it quickly before pocketing it. Wait a minute. You're the cable guy from Kosice? Joe is telling me about you. A flicker of uncertainty appeared on Skodova's face. Ambler pressed the advantage. If you ain't busy, maybe you could come with me. Joe and I were just talking in that little private lounge out back. Had to nip out here to wet my whistle, but I ain't one for crowds. Seems to me you and I just might be able to do some business. You know about electronic data systems? Joseph is where? The question was polite but pointed. I'll bring you to him, Ambler said. But first I promised I'd snag him a bottle of Slivovitz. As Jan Skodova followed him, he borrowed a bottle of the plum brandy from a gently protesting bartender, and then led the Slovak businessman through a corridor that led to a series of small rooms. Ambler stepped into the first one, where the door was ajar, indicating it was unoccupied. Jan Skodova followed Ambler in, looked around, and said testily, Please explain. He was just here a moment ago, Ambler said, shutting the door behind him. Must have had to take a piss. Less than a minute later, he left the room alone. Skodova would be unconscious for at least an hour or two. The operative had propped him in a chair, slumped forward on the table, his shirt front drenched with the brandy, the remains of the bottle nearby. Anyone who entered the room would draw the obvious conclusion and select another place to meet. It was not perfect, but it would do. It would have to. Now Ambler swept through the crowd quickly, clockwise and then counterclockwise, alert to anything beyond the usual range of human anxiety, resentment, envy, vanity, and pique. He glanced at his watch. It was now 5:15, 15 minutes before the president's big speech at the conference's plenary session. Already, Ambler saw people were beginning to file into the Congress Hall, whose doors were along the wall opposite the stairway. At a doorway to the rear of the hall, cameramen, dressed far more casually than the conference participants, began entering with their outsized equipment. His heart began to race. He caught a glimpse of a woman in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, her auburn hair tousled, and again he felt that tiny fluttering bird within his breast. Hope. This time it almost took wing. It was Laurel. She had done exactly what she said she would, had arrived on schedule and secured the equipment. "You'll need me," she had said. Christ, that was an understatement. He needed her in so many ways. Moments later, the two of them had ducked into the still deserted balcony above the seating area. "The camera crews are going to be arriving in just a couple of minutes. Lose the jacket, lose the tie, and you'll blend right in." They were the first words she spoke to him. Her eyes, alive with love and devotion, spoke to him of things no words could convey. He quickly stuffed his blazer and tie into one of the equipment boxes that were lying around. Now Laurel reached over and mussed his hair. The grooming appropriate for a forum participant was not appropriate for a cameraman. "Looking good," she finally said. "Any leads yet?" "Not yet," Ambler said, feeling an upwelling of despair that he quickly tried to purge, both from his voice and from his heart. "Where's Caston?" "He's probably off talking to his assistant. He's been on the phone with him a lot." Ambler nodded but said nothing. The simple act of speaking was now an effort. In the next small sliver of time he would succeed or he would fail. It was as simple as that. "We've got 2 cameras here. Got you one with a 48x optical zoom." She handed him the bulky camera, which was secured to a folding tripod. Both were a sort of drab green. "Thanks," he said. He meant, "I love you more than life itself." "Think he'll be seated in front?" "Could be," Ambler said hoarsely. He cleared his throat. "Could be seated further back, too. Too many possibilities." "Well, you're here. Just do what you do." Bravely, she was maintaining a bluff, almost jovial tone. Yet Ambler could tell that, like him, she was terrified. The effects of stress could be paradoxical and unpredictable, like fueling an engine. Sometimes it provided a surge of power. Sometimes a flooded engine would stall. So much depended on the next several minutes. "Just do what you do," she had said. What if he didn't? What if he couldn't? Liu Eng was the beloved leader of the world's most populous nation. He was not just the hope of his people, he was the hope of the world. With the squeeze of a trigger, that hope would be extinguished. China would be derailed from the carefully laid tracks of peaceful evolution and pushed onto a collision course, and the results would surely be nothing short of cataclysmic. An outraged, seething population of billions would clamor for revenge. A blind fury multiplied by sheer mass could pose a peril greater than any the planet had ever confronted. In the artificial courtyard adjacent to them, the great and the good and the not very good at all chewed on canapes, checked their costly watches, and, wafting the fragrance of power, began to fill the Congress Hall. They were excited, of course, though many of them were too grand to let on. Liu Eng was arguably the most important statesman on the planet, and quite possibly the most effective. Visionaries were plentiful, but Liu Eng had so far shown the ability to translate vision into reality. These thoughts raised dust storms within Ambler's head. He had to banish them, had to banish thinking itself, if he were if he was to see clearly. The stakes had never been higher. They could scarcely be higher. The hall itself was larger than it seemed at first. Simply arranging the chairs, each chair was separate, its chrome frame in contact with its neighbors, but not physically connected to them, must have taken hours. At each seat was a plastic-wrapped RF headset, which would receive and transmit a simultaneous translation in one of 10 languages, depending on the channel selected. As the crowd drifted into the hall, Ambler decided to make a first pass through the floor without the camera's zoom lens. He'd be relying on what his naked eyes could take in, but would enjoy greater mobility. His eyes swept toward the front of the hall. 2 immense blue panels on either side of the stage bore the familiar World Economic Forum logo. At the rear of the stage was a backdrop like a checkerboard, with tiers of smaller blue rectangles emblazoned with the same white logo, the effect like that of a Chuck Close portrait. A large screen hung 2/3 of the way down the central section of the stage. The video feed from the official WEF camera would be projected upon it for those who were seated in the rear of the plenary hall and could not see the figure at the lectern. Ambler checked his watch again and then looked around him. The seats were nearly all filled now. It was astonishing to see how quickly it had happened, and the Chinese leader would be making his appearance in a matter of minutes. Ambler paced across the front row as if looking for a vacant seat. His eyes darted from face to face, but he detected only the banal sentiments of the self-important. A pudgy man with a narrow stenographer's notebook exuded the sort of anxiety appropriate to a journalist with an impending deadline. A lean man in a loud Glenurquhart plaid gave off the buzzy exhilaration of a self-made hedge fund manager who is about to see a great man in the flesh. Another audience member, a woman Ambler vaguely recognized from pictures, a CEO of a tech company, blonde and perfectly coiffed, looked distracted as if rehearsing talking points for an upcoming interview. A silver-haired man with wire-rimmed bifocals, a forehead speckled with liver spots, and eyebrows you could pull a brush through, was scrutinizing the small page of instructions that accompanied the headset and looking faintly dispirited as if he had recently got word of a fall in stock prices. Ambler walked slowly along the rightmost aisle, carefully looking at a photographer carrying an outsized SLR camera equipped with an enormous lens. The man looked affable and simple, pleased perhaps with the position he had staked out by the wall, and ready to defend it against any rival who staked a claim to it. At his feet was a hard-sided photographer's case, on which countless travel stickers had been attached and carelessly ripped off. Ambler's eyes swept down the rows. There were so many people. Christ, there were too many people. Why did he think he could? He reeled himself in, shut down that line of thought. Thinking was the enemy. He cleared his mind again, tried to achieve a state of pure receptivity, drifting through the hall like an invisible cloud, like a shadow, seeing all, seen by none. A kaleidoscope of human emotion lay before him. The man with the fixed grin, who Ambler would have sworn to it, was desperate to go to the bathroom and equally desperate not to lose his seat. The woman who was trying to make conversation with the stranger next to her. A man who had sized her up and dismissed her in a single numbing look, leaving her fearful that she had been insulted, hopeful that it was a simple linguistic misunderstanding. A flush-cheeked, jowly man with a comb-over who seemed disgruntled that he had not had time to down a proper highball. The know-it-all who, teetering past the edge of his knowledge, was discoursing about contemporary Chinese politics to his companions, employees, who politely disguised their resentment. There were hundreds just like them, all with their peculiar patterns of fascination, boredom, peevishness, and anticipation. daubs from the palette of ordinary human emotion. None of them was the person Ambler was looking for. He knew the type. He couldn't analyze it. He just recognized it when he saw it, or really felt it, like the wave of cold you feel when opening a freezer on a warm day. It was the glacial deliberateness of the professional killer, the man who was too alert to his surroundings, the man whose anticipation was not simply of what he would witness, but of what he would do. Ambler could feel it, always could. But now, when it mattered most, nothing. Panic swelled inside his chest, and again he pushed it down. He race-walked to the rear of the long hall and mounted the narrow terrazzo stairs to the balcony. In the center, he saw a battery of 3 stationary cameras and half a dozen irregulars from media companies around the world. The balcony would be an ideal site for a gunman. It would take relatively little skill to hit the target from such an elevated perch. Ambler met Laurel's eyes, a parched man taking a quick sip from a desert oasis, and then glanced at the others, his eyes seeking out each strange visage. Nothing. No twitch on the dowsing rod, no click on the geyser counter, nothing. The camera eye could prove his salvation. Wordlessly, he came over to Laurel and took the camera she had prepared for him, the one with the 48x zoom lens. For purposes of show, she had stationed herself at an older twin-lens camera, even more dinged and dented than his. Struggling for calm, he angled the camera head downward with the knob level and took in the members of the audience below. The nature of the sight lines meant that an assassin in the audience would have to position himself in the front half of the seating section. This still left 500 candidates. How had he ever imagined he would have a chance? He felt as if a band were tightening around his chest, as if he were breathing against resistance. To think of the odds, but no, such things were best left to the likes of Clayton Caston. Ambler breathed a different atmosphere. He had to banish self-consciousness, banish rationality. He could not fail. If he had been faltering, at least the camera was working just as they had hoped. Its automatic focus provided almost immediate clarity of field. Don't think, see. The faces were sometimes in silhouette, often at odd angles, but the camera electronics were sophisticated enough to compensate swiftly for variations in light level, and the level of detail was astonishing. He studied face after face in the viewfinder, waiting for the prickling that would tell him to pause, to look again. Laurel, standing close behind him, murmured something encouraging at him. "It'll come, my dear," she said softly. He could feel the warmth of her breath against his neck, and it was the only thing that kept the black miasma of despair from engulfing him. In a world of falsity and pretense, she was the one true thing, his pole star, his lodestone. It was his belief in himself that was unsustainable. He had peered at row after row, and he could only conclude that his instincts at last had failed him. Would someone dart in from the entrance doors at the last moment? Was there a face he had somehow not seen? Presently a rustle went through the crowd, and he heard the sound of a side door shutting, locked now to outsiders. The guards would not open them again until after the speech was concluded. Briskly, the founder and director of the World Economic Forum, a tall, nearly bald man with steel-rimmed glasses, strode across the stage to make a few introductory remarks. He wore a dark blue suit and a blue and white tie, the colors of his organization. Ambler turned around and glanced behind him, where Laurel was standing, tassel-haired and beautiful and alert, peering through the eye cup of her own bulkily long-lens television camera, and he tried to conceal the abyss that he felt in his own soul. He knew she was not fooled. She mouthed the words, "I love you," and it was as if a glimmer of light appeared in a long, dark tunnel. He could not give up. He must not give up. The killer was here, ready to derail human history with a single squeeze of the trigger. It was up to Ambler to find him, and the Ambler who could do so was the Ambler who was Tarquin. He was Tarquin now. He squinted once more at the viewfinder. Sound disappeared for him, save only for the slow thudding of his own heart, the sound of seconds ticking past. Adrian Choi shuffled through the dossiers that Caitlin had given him, those personnel records from the psychiatric facility that Caston had been so intent on getting his hands on. Personnel records, for crying out loud. A bunch of goddamn resumes, for the most part. It should not have been so hard to get a hold of them. But it had been. That was why he figured he might as well go through them with a goddamn magnifying glass. Boring as shit, most of them. A whole lot of technical schools and community colleges and military tours. For the orderlies, anyway. Psychiatrists with degrees from Case Western Reserve or the University of Miami Medical School. Nurses with diplomas from the Naval School of Health Sciences and other places with similar names. Guards with backgrounds in the 6th MP group or the 202nd, whatever the hell that meant, with the initial CID in parentheses, like that. Except there was one, what would Caston call it? Anomaly. Yes, it was definitely an anomaly. Someone was knocking on his door, loudly. Adrian sat up with a jerk. Nobody knocked that loudly on Clayton Caston's door, for Christ's sake. Opening it, operating on some dim intuition, Adrian decided not to answer it. A few minutes later, he heard departing footsteps. That's right, nobody but us chickens. Maybe it was some jackass who thought it was a storage room with the printer cartridges. Or maybe it was something else. Adrian didn't feel like dealing with it either way. He started dialing Caston's cell phone. It was one of those international kinds, which rang wherever the user was in the world, and it would be their 4th conversation within the hour. Caston answered immediately. Adrian briefly gave him the update. Caston had him repeat certain details, not testily, but with an air of urgency. And when you cross-check, Adrian said, the social security numbers don't match. Adrian listened to Caston's reply. He had never heard him sound so breathless. That's what I thought, Adrian put in. Anomalous, huh? A steady and expensively attired gravitas, the director of the World Economic Forum, concluded his slightly grandiloquent remarks, received a warm hand of applause, and took a seat to the right of the stage. Then the applause began to grow as Lu Eng himself walked on stage with a gentle loping gait and took his own place before the lectern. He was, well, physically smaller than Ambler had expected, somehow. Yet there was something large about him as well. His mien, M-I-E-N, conveyed an almost bigger-than-life serenity, a sense of great patience, even wisdom, a gentleness that knew itself to be stronger than brutality. He thanked the director of the World Economic Forum in a lilting, melodic English, and then began to speak in Chinese. He was addressing the world, but his own countrymen were a large part of the world too, and when his speech was broadcast to them, he wanted them to know he had spoken his native tongue with pride and eloquence. He wanted them to know he was no returning sea turtle, no hai gui, but a citizen of China as authentic as any of them. Ambler could understand nothing of what the man said, but a great deal from the way he said it. So often the propositional content of language was mere distraction from the subtleties of tone and intonation. Simple emotions were quoted by a lacquer of complex ideas. Lu Eng was wry and funny. The headset-equipped audience guffawed at just the moment Ambler would have guessed, and then was somber and impassioned. He understood a truth that he wanted others to understand as well. He was not selling them, he was telling them. It was not the usual politician's voice. It was the voice of a genuine statesman, the voice of somebody who envisaged a future of peace and prosperity and wanted to invite the rest of the world to join that future. A man who saw that cooperation could be as powerful and powerfully productive as competition. A man who was helping to bring tolerance and enlightenment not only to the Middle Kingdom, but to the world at large. A man who was slated for death at any moment. Somewhere in the hall, the assassin was biding his time, and Ambler's instincts, his particular gift, had failed him utterly. Again, Ambler scanned the rows beneath him, gazing so intently into the viewfinder that his vision began to blur, his neck to stiffen. Now, abruptly, almost involuntarily, he looked up and craned his head around, his gaze taking in the camera operators and coming to rest on Laurel's face. She had been peering through her camera at the man at the lectern, clearly as mesmerized by the statesman as he had been, and it was a moment before she realized Ambler was watching her. Something rippled through her face, and then she turned to him with an expression of shaky resolve, an expression that was also brimming with love and loyalty and devotion. Ambler blinked hard. He felt as if there were a sty in his eye. No, not a sty, but what had he just seen? The temperature of the room plummeted, it seemed to him. He felt as if he had been whipped by an Arctic blast. Yet it was madness. He could not have seen what he thought he had seen. He replayed it in his mind. Laurel, his beloved Laurel, studying the scene through the camera calmly, no, stonily. Could it be? And then the look on her face, a moment before it was wreathed in a loving smile. Again, he replayed that fraction of a second in his mind, and he saw another expression on her face, as fleeting as a firefly's glow and as unmistakable. It was an expression of pure and crystalline contempt.